Hello. Sorry, guys, we've got to. Yeah, let's begin.
Oh, beginning.
We are beginning. Thank you, everyone, for turning up this morning. It's called Inspiration Archive. What we're hoping to do is to inspire you as filmmakers to use archives in ways that maybe you haven't thought of before. We're going to show some clips that each of us have been involved in the process of commissioning, making, finding at various stages. And we've all, from my side, I work almost exclusively with archives in terms of making them as a filmmaker. So I'm going to show a clip from a film called Senna to begin with. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to show a clip from a film called Plot for Peace, which hopefully some of you saw. It was showed yesterday, wasn't it? It's showing again today, I think. And then we're going to get a bit, because there's a question mark hanging in the trailer, which we can get Mandy and the rest of the team to talk about. And then we're going to have two clips, one from Mitchell and Kenyon, which hopefully everyone knows about Mitchell and Kenyon in terms of a brilliant piece of archive, and then from Servants, which Annabelle and Rowley were both involved in. Yeah, it's as we go through, yeah, so my name is Paul Bell. I'm the moderator for today, and then we're going to go along. So,
I'm Annabelle Hobley. I'm an executive producer making films through the BFI, through the BBC, and I work for Betty.
I'm Rowley Keating. I was in broadcasting for many years, set up BBC 4, was controller of BBC 2, and last year, though, I made the move across to become chief executive of the British Library, and I'm here because I'm very interested in the crossover between a huge memory institution like that with its resources and the way documentarists use archive materials, not just audio-visual, but pure audio, text, print, manuscripts, maps, and so on. And that's where the collaboration with some of what Annabelle's done really kicks in.
I think hopefully that's something we're going to come into. It's not just, we think of it, we're filmmakers and it's film, but hopefully in the short time we've got, get to all of those. But Plot for Peace team.
Mandy Jacobson. I'm a producer and co-director of Plot for Peace, and I run an initiative out of Johannesburg called the African Oral History Archive.
I'm Stephen Smith. I used to be the journalist, the Africa editor of Le Monde, and I was drawn into this project, Plot for Peace, as a historical consultant. I now teach at Duke University in the United States, and a historical consultant and scriptwriter of Plot for Peace.
I'm Carlos Agullo, co-director of Plot for Peace and editor of the film. My background is more in fiction films as an editor, and this is my first documentary.
So we're going to start. I'm going to show a clip now from Senna, which I was the archive producer on Senna. It's a nice place to start, I think, with this, because it's not someone's phone. We didn't. If you do have phones, can you please turn them off?
French mobile.
As an archive producer, it was my job literally to look through all of the footage and find all of the footage. And it's a weird thing. As an archive producer, you kind of become a bit of a scriptwriter, a director, an editor, all kind of rolled into one. Let's play the clip, and then I can talk a bit more after that.
In 1978, I came to Europe for the first time to compete outside Brazil in the World Championship. It was pure driving, pure racing. There wasn't any politics, no money involved either, so it was real racing.
Aquela aventura de andar em kart e ficasse só nisso. No entretanto, está tomando uma dimensão maior e a gente se preocupa um pouco pelo fato da Fórmula 1 deve vir por aí, não é?
Que Deus proteja ele sempre e todos os perigos, que é o que eu mais temo. E quero agradecer ele pelo filho que ele é, por esse ano que ele fez de trabalho honesto e bem feito. Isso é mais importante que qualquer título para mim.
Few people really do know myself. They just don't understand what it takes from a racing driver, somebody that has left behind thousands of miles away, family and friends, to live in Europe, being so young and always in a fighting wheel. Nothing ever has come easy.
Chegou o grande momento. Ayrton está pronto para pilotar pela primeira vez um carro de Fórmula 1.
Eu acho que Deus está me dando um presente. Eu vim esperando há muito tempo. E ele está me ajudando também muito a ficar calmo, tranquilo, numa boa.
Now, I've done a few of these talks where we've shown various clips, and I've done kind of not just conferences, but kind of master classes and things like that. And I've never shown this clip before. And quite interestingly, I was talking to Asif Kapadia, the director, because we're now working on another all-archive film about Amy Winehouse at the moment. And I was like, well, you know, talking about why we're doing this conference today, and he was like, well, you know, actually, I think you should show the introduction, because it really, you get everything that we were trying to do in the film in that piece there. You know, it's not about him being a racing driver. It's not a film about Formula One, but all of the tricks we use to tell the story are there, and it's really showing archive in a way that, you know, the traditional way of making documentaries is to go and film interviews, and then you cut away to the talking heads who describe what's going on. The one person we could never interview in the making of Senna was, of course, Ayrton Senna. So we decided if we can't interview him, we're not going to interview anyone else. We then failed in that, because every night you run into the point where you've got story points that you need to be told, and so we interviewed other people, but we just used the archive, the audio as well, to go with that. Interesting as well, the first, that brilliant kind of footage of him in the go-kart, which is all kind of shot on Super 8 by an Italian journalist. The making of Senna was, because with archive, you're always dealing with rights and issues to do with that. Pretty much most things that appear in the film Senna are owned by Bernie Ecclestone, who owns Formula One. We were trying to make a deal with Bernie for years and years. We were kind of in a bit of limbo, and so I then had to go and find other sources to find this footage. Tracked down this guy who lived in Paris, went over there, he went, well, you've got all this Super 8 stuff, but you won't be interested in that. And of course, that's, from any filmmakers, that's the bit you are interested in. And that then kind of, that was probably the first piece of archive I found on that film, and it's the beginning of the film. The flip side of that is, until we got our brilliant editor to come in later on in it, we always started with the funeral. And then it's just those, the archive was always driving the story. So from us, it's like, if it's not in the archive, it's not in the story. That's one approach to making films. That, we hope, leads into the next clip we're going to show, because in the trailer for Plot for Peace, there is, I haven't seen the film yet, so I'm really excited. And also, we've only just met to actually hear how the whole process came about. So if we can play the trailer for Plot for Peace, and then we'll talk a bit more about that.
A new South Africa has to eliminate the racial hatred and offer guarantees to all.
Nelson Mandela a gagné. L'ex-prisonnier va devenir président. Il va libérer le pays de l'apartheid de son enfermement. C'est ça l'histoire avec un grand H. Une histoire qui est en fait la somme de beaucoup de petites histoires, dont la mienne. Avec mes amis, dans les pays de la ligne de front, nous avons fait taire les armes pour que l'apartheid puisse mourir en paix. Je suis moi-même ce jour-là dans le stade de Soweto. Mandela ne sait rien de moi. Rien de mon histoire secrète, qui pourtant se mélange à la sienne. Qu'importe. Les cartes se sont parfaitement alignées. La partie est finie.
He never said one word about his contribution.
Je pense que Jean-Yves Olivier, de toute façon, appartenait au service français.
The chance of being a double agent who didn't care about this.
When you have a man like Jean-Yves, nothing will leak, but the results will be brought about. And this is what he did.
He would have played whatever other role, but not a political one.
What he was looking for, I'm not sure, because he never asked me money.
Il y a des moments où la politique doit être plus souple. Et pour être souple, elle a besoin de secrets.
The mysterious businessman, codenamed Monsieur Jacques, played a leading role in the delicate negotiations which led to the multiple prisoner swap in Maputo, Mozambique earlier this year.
He was one of the first to figure out the great secret of Africa.
Personne n'est au courant de ce que je fais.
J'étais tout seul. Tout seul.
So, one of the things in archive is it kind of gets seen as being detective work a lot of the time. People always ask, oh, you've uncovered. They always talk about archive being gems, as if you've dug them up somewhere. But I think in this case, it was kind of like that, wasn't it?
Yeah, very much. I'm in a privileged position to run an archive project that started off with a private foundation having this great passion to record the testimonies of the movers and shakers on the African continent. But what they had done was that when they started doing those stories, they never started out with an angle. So they were just there to say, well, let's record what happened from South Africa from 1948 to 1994. So when I inherited this mass of interviews, we didn't quite know what to do with them. I mean, it's one thing to have them on a portal where people can access them, but we were interested in how you can start engaging with this material and how you can start telling stories out of this. So when we started immersing ourselves in this archive, through interviewing former Minister Pik Botha, he was a foreign minister, he told us about this prisoner exchange and told us about a curious Frenchman called Monsieur Jacques. We dug around and couldn't find any archive except one piece where it wouldn't have come up through typing in Monsieur Jacques, because it was, I mean, the whole question of tagging this material in a library system is another minefield. And there we discovered in the South African archives this little clip about this award that Monsieur Jacques had been given. We then go to the prisoner that was released through the prisoner exchange. He's written a little book in 1998, and he also refers to Jean-Yves Olivier as we came to know him, but at the time to Monsieur Jacques. So when we started this story, we didn't start the story thinking we're going out to make a story about a curious Frenchman called Jean-Yves Olivier. We were really just digging in South African archives to see what stories we could be telling to tell many stories about South Africa's transition. And there we discovered Monsieur Jacques, and that then started a whole process of getting Stephen and Carlos involved.
Well, Stephen, how did you get involved in?
Just give you my perspective. When I see this clip now, immediately I recognize Jean-Yves Olivier, because I had written about him in a book, The African Hands. You may be familiar with the post-colonial sort of proximity, France with its former colonies. And so we had written with a friend of mine a book called African Hands, and one chapter was about Jean-Yves Olivier. So I knew Jean-Yves Olivier. In addition, I had covered the negotiations initiated by Chester Crocker to end regional war in southern Africa. So I knew I thought I knew the story, and I knew the personnel, and in this instance, one of the protagonists, but they didn't fit. I didn't know, I actually discovered the story that the film tells while doing the film. And sometimes we had to go back to people we had already interviewed, because other people told us other things, and we had to redo our interviews.
It sounds, one of the things that I think always comes up with archive, especially, is to do with time, and that you have to have the time to do it. With features, you get a bit more time. Most of us are working on TV where you don't have time, because you know it's got to go up 9 o'clock on Monday night. So maybe that's something we can come to later on. Carlos, I'm interested to know, did you come in to edit, or were you directing before you were editing, or
initially I was contacted as an editor.
Yeah.
But very quickly, because the producing this movie, as you can imagine, we shot in I don't know how many countries, but quite a few in several continents, and it was impossible for one person to produce and direct the film. So I initially was contacted as an editor, but very soon I was co-directing with Mandy, and. For me, what's been very, very interesting, I think the main thing that I learned as an editor and director is that when you're working with archive, it's not so much different as working on a fiction film. And I was...
hopefully that's because what we found on Senna, we had two editors, Greers, who started, and then Chris King, who came in at the end. And it was, we'd kind of reached a point where we couldn't get the film down below about an hour and a half, and we needed to get it down to about 90 minutes, if we less than that. And Chris went, oh yeah, just swap the front around. But it was that kind of, we had coverage. What we found, the more we dug, the more we found. And it's like, what we also discovered was that actually, you do have to treat archive as if it's rushes, as if it's material that you've shot yourself. And once you have that approach, as opposed to it's just something you're going to slot in to illustrate something that you hope someone's going to tell you, then and let that tell the story.
Precisely what you were saying in the beginning. I was feeling so much identified to your speech, because it's exactly the lesson that I learned while working with archive, that you cannot
convert to archive.
Have somebody telling the story and then illustrate it, and the guy saying, then I took a plane, and have the guy seeing the man taking the plane and all this, because then it becomes just an illustration, it becomes boring, and you have to create a new reality or a new way of telling a story through archive. And many times I was asking myself, maybe you want to tell something about President Sassou Nguesso, that he was concerned, and all the African leaders were concerned about something, and then we don't have that much as much archive as we would like to.
You can slow it down every night, and stretch it out. And lots of driving shots and things.
All kinds of tricks, but at the end, you're thinking, what's the main point here? To let people see who is Sassou Nguesso, or to create tension, to create the feeling that you need for this scene, and maybe. Sometimes I would rather have a clip that has less quality.
It's about the story. I mean, the quality, the archive is we were mentioning it before. I mean, that clip that we had that I showed of Senna, it was Super 8, but it was we didn't get the Super 8. So we were relying on someone else's telecine, and it was a beta SP, and it kind of had that grainy quality. We're then going to show stuff later on in the film, which is from a beta SP of like a shiny floor show, kind of like a TV thing, which is very, it's cleaner in a way, but you've got to grade it to a level that matches the rest of the archive.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't let the quality, I think it's the quality of the story as opposed to the quality of the archive.
Definitely.
Which is the thing.
And at the end, I think that lack of quality
makes
tells a lot about.
I think it's authentic. It keeps you.
It makes your project richer, and it tells a lot about what you're talking about. Because if you're making a story that happened on the 70s, that lack of quality will not be the same lack of quality that you would have now in YouTube with a video shot now, because it's. So all those textures have a lot to do with your.
The textures, they're very important. With taking that as our next cue, we're going to show the clip from Mitchell and Kenyon, which again, it's amazing to me in terms of how brilliant it looks at the quality that's in it. So.
This is Morecambe Seafront in the summer of 1901. It was filmed by two pioneering filmmakers from Lancashire. "800 of these remarkable short films were recently discovered in the basement of a shop in Blackburn. but they were nearly lost forever. The films of Sagar Mitchell and James Kenyon take us to the world of ordinary people 100 years ago. They capture them going about their daily lives, leaving work, watching football, catching a tram in the rush hour. These films by Mitchell and Kenyon, who are based here at Blackburn, offer a unique glimpse into a remote Edwardian world. We'll look at life in the city, life at work, in an age before the cinema existed. But what interests me in particular are the people who appear in these films. What can these films tell us about their lives?
With that, we'll see, there's themes of football, commuting, wanting to appear on television, kind of going up to the camera, things which are still around today. So, but in terms of, I mean, one of the key thing there is that this was discovered kind of later on, but it's switching from, you know, with Senna, what we got is, one of the reasons why it works is that he's essentially a movie star and he carries the film. Whereas Mitchell and Kenny, it's all about real people. It's all about the people there. So just in terms of how you're both involved in this.
Well, we should probably say I was involved in commissioning it as controller of BBC Two at the time, and Annabelle was involved in
the making of it.
In the making of it.
Producing and directing of it.
And just to give
what came first? There was the discovery of Mitchell.
The discovery came first, and I mean, I guess it's partly interesting from a. It was obviously a very, very eye-catching discovery. It's very rare that a vast resource like that suddenly comes to.
It's a once in a lifetime.
Yeah,
it had film historians around the world drooling. It never happens.
No.
It was like the Valley of the Kings. But nonetheless, it was. I remember the proper television commissioners' debates about whether you would really find an audience for a large quantity of black and white, silent, unstructured archive material. And I remember there was a big debate back and forth. And in the end, the trust on the commissioning side was that feeling, I think, was bottled beautifully there, which is just the sense of jaw-dropping wonder at the sheer clarity of those images.
It is. It's beautiful.
And that somehow a veil had been drawn back and content that you would never normally get to see brought to life come to life. So we did commission it, and we took a punt, 3 hours of primetime BBC Two, and the most startling moment, I think, was the launch audience figures, which were
4.3 million.
4.3 million people, which was, for those who don't know the currency, that was probably 2 or 3 times what the ratings experts had predicted, probably including me, if I'm being honest, for it. But because this is an area I've always loved and been preoccupied and fascinated by, a little part of me as a sort of channel controller felt vindicated, but I had no idea, and I think it's a lot of it was the art of how you just wove stories out of it.
Well, one of the big questions early on when trying to get it commissioned was, is there enough richness in this archive? Yes, it's amazing quality. Yes, you see faces very close up, but about 80% of these 800 films were what's called factory gate films. So the two filmmakers...
I didn't realize it was that much.
Yeah. They stood in front of the factory gate at lunchtime, because that's when the light is best, and all these workers from mostly the cotton mills in Lancashire, and many in Sheffield as well, streamed out past the filmmakers, and they'd film them, and then they'd show themselves to themselves, very like telly today, in the fair that night or that weekend. So that's basically how they made their money. So the question was, so you have 80% of them being factory gate films, and then you have a bit of variety in the others. So the question from the commissioners and the controllers was, is there enough variety? How on earth are you going to make 3 hours of television, 180 minutes out of this material? So we had to, and at the same time, the material was only just being transferred from nitrate into something that we could look at. Plus, we didn't know what it was. So a vast majority of the film was unlabeled. Sometimes there was a date, rarely. Sometimes there was a place. And we did it was a co-production with the British Film Institute, but also, very importantly, the National Fairground Archive, based here at Sheffield University. And they knew when the films were being shown, in which fair, because they knew all about the fairground operators. And through that, you got a date. Yeah. And through the date, you can look in the newspapers, which are in the British Library and Colindale. And then you actually found sometimes reports of the films. So that meant that you could actually spot individual people in those films, because you could see that cheeky man with the top hat, he's this fairground operator. And you knew that fairground operators did strange things, like they'd place black people coming off the ferry in Liverpool in order to attract more people, because they'd want to go and see a black face amongst the crowd. So all these fairground tricks are imposed into the Mitchell and Kenyon film. And so through the National Fairground researchers and the professor there, we managed to kind of decode the film. So it was a kind of, that's why the films are now about hats and shawls and trams and egg rolling and fairgrounds. And paint this amazing picture of life largely in the north, but also kind of Plymouth all the way up to Scotland in that time.
It does sound, that you're finding the story in the archive. That's
yes,
part of it.
And during the production process, which was a bit scary.
The stuff that goes on behind, and it's great linking up with other places. That leads us to the newspaper library, that leads us to here, which is, if there's something you can all take away from this, is that it's not just, we're going to order something up from the BBC or from AP and it arrives. It's that it's the richness of everything that goes with it, the digging that needs to happen. Just remind me, so Servants, which the clip we're going to show next, that was after Mitchell and Kenyon?
Yes, Servants was on television in September.
So you can maybe talk about it a bit more later, but what you learned from Mitchell and Kenyon, if there's anything you took into Servants and how you...
Yes, I realised, thinking about this, that we were discussing, you mentioned that archive is sometimes used illustratively, just slotted in, and in fact, sometimes it's just kind of wallpaper and the commentary does all the work. But I realised that just thinking about where I've come from, I've spanned the whole different ways of dealing with archive, from illustrative all the way through to kind of the point at which archive, be it film footage or objects, documents, documentary evidence, is the story itself. Because I started off, and illustrative needn't be bad, is what I was trying to say. So I started off working...
It has a different, it's created under a different
yeah.
rule, and you establish a rule at the beginning, and I think you need to stick to that. And
with everything, it's establishing your story and what the rules within your story, how you're going to tell it. I mean, what I've always found interesting, and it works with Mitchell and Kenyon, is that yes, you have all this wonderful archive, then you have reconstruction that goes into it as well. Yeah. And it doesn't jar, and it's like, oh, hold on, you know, there's lots of ways that it could have, it could have been, oh, this is going to be quite cheesy, but no, it actually really works, because we, as we found out with Senna, we wanted to do everything authentic. We ran into the problem, you've got to tell the story, and sometimes, actually, as filmmakers, you need to put yourself, you need to interject into the story as well. If we show the clip from Servants now, then we'll lead on to some more stories.
These are just a small selection of a vast, vast literature aimed at servants produced in the 19th century, and there's all kinds of things here. There are magazines, there are prayer books, there are fables, there are personal stories, so it's a really vast amount of stuff. How would they get this material? Well, some would be given to them by their masters or mistresses. We've got one here, a present for servants from their masters. Others would be given to them by perhaps their parents or relatives before they left for service. Others still, they might just buy themselves. There's one here, the Servants Magazine, which I think is a commercial publication. And it's fascinating because it shows us the journey that the servant is expected to make, from disordered country cottage to ordered family home where she's stoking the fire. A crucial part of that journey for her is a moral and religious teaching that helps her to make this journey. So here we've got the servant kneeling by her bed, saying her prayers, the servant maid. Though servitude's my destined lot, and I am doomed to roam, far from my native peaceful cot, far from my friends and home. If God saw fit to make me great, he would not this deny. And while I'm in a meaner state, he will my wants supply. And the message there is that servants should be happy with their position in life. God's looking after them. They're doing the right thing. There's another one here, which is a daily prayer book for servants from the 1850s. We've got prayers for a housekeeper or butler or any place in authority, and then prayers for a lady's maid, a nurse, an undermaid servant, and a manservant. There are also specific prayers on specific themes, and just listen to these themes. Humility, meekness, contentment, honesty, truthfulness. It's the one about contentment that really gets me. For contentment. Almighty Father, who alone art wise, yea, wisdom itself, make me to feel that in thy providence thou orderest all things for the best, and grant that I may be able to be satisfied with the station in which thou hast placed me, not envying those who are richer and higher than I, but content to be poor and lonely in this world. And I think that says it all.
It's what I like about that is one, actually where it's filmed. It is in an archive. It's you know, it has the richness because of that. But if you
yeah, I think we've all learnt that basically audiences like knowing where the stuff is kept. And often that can be part of the story. So going into it doesn't need to be a hidden archive, but you know, a local studies collection in St Ives, or in through the big gates of the British Library, or travelling down to basement 5. That was filmed in basement 5. There are 5 basements below the British Library in cold storage. Everyone was actually wearing massive coats behind the camera. Pam was very cold. That is kind of part of the journey, and that audiences like being led into a kind of, you know, a secret treasure trove, a hidden world of where the archives are, and that is you know, it's part of our history, and it actually tells you an awful lot about the country, kind of going into these places.
I mean, just to build on that, I mean, by the way, that was made before I made the flip to go to the British Library, so there's lots of different connections here, but I guess it's listening to the run of the conversation. The move I made from a world broadcasting, quite documentary focused, into the library felt oddly natural. Now we're in this digital age where all those boundaries and categories between different kinds of archives, even between different kinds of institutions, just begin to blur a little. And you find, I find stepping in to take charge of the British Library, which is this extraordinary memory institution. It's 150 million items of all kinds, some of them dating back centuries or even millennia. It's not just books, it's newspapers, magazines, maps, manuscripts, personal archives, huge oral history and sound archives, really, really profound resources, unmediated but catalogued and accessible and discoverable. And I realized that the hard boundaries, I mean, the library itself is a creative institution. It forges stories out of this material. The propaganda exhibition that's on at the moment is a kind of multimedia documentary. It fuses film and artifacts and so on to carve a stimulating and emotional story. But it's also there to open itself to enable and encourage others to do research. And we find we're bridging constantly academia, hard, proper academic research with television research, and actually at their best, they both feed off each other. You can see, you know, original research happening almost on camera, and certainly, as you say, during the process of filmmaking. And that feels like, you know, if the institutions, like the one I'm now in charge of, can understand more about that process and vice versa, then it feels like we're just beginning here. There could be even more blends.
Yeah. Looking at it, just the journey we've gone through today, it's like one of the things we really tried to do with Senna was to make it as if you weren't watching an archive film.
Sure.
That was, in a sense, that was our trick, of that we're not, by not cutting away to a talking head 10, 15 years later, we're making you stay in the moment. One, because most of the people who are watching it, although I met someone last night who didn't know the ending of Senna when they watched it, which is quite rare, and it's all, and 2 people now. So it's which I can only, well, I'm really jealous of kind of knowing kind of like, oh, well, how's this going to end? But no, if we do that, we take, so what we're trying to do is make it like as much like a normal film as possible. But now we're reaching the point now where it's actually in Servants, where we're showing the archive in the, it's that process of actually, and it's just, there isn't a simple way of using archive, because in a way, now with YouTube, which is this other institution of memory, like the British Library, which is making it so essentially everything is archive. That's how I kind of look at it. Sorry.
Can I just ask Paul a question? When you set out to make Senna, did you know that all this archive existed, or what was the idea?
Yeah, that's the thing. One, it was never really scripted, and also when we look at the, looking at it, one of the most interesting things I always think when you look at how films are made is go back and look at the budget and the production manager's notes, and it's like, yes, we had money in there for reconstruction, we had money in there for interviews, because we're in a position where we were waiting for everything essentially to be green lit, but we were kind of working on it. We were forced to just go, well, where can we find footage? And then we started making it, and then it was like, and because Asif Kapadi, who's the director, from a drama background, was probably quite reticent about actually going shooting interviews because he probably didn't know how to do it, to be perfectly honest. And it's like, actually, I want to see as much as I can. And we went far enough down there where there was this kind of collective sense of, right, let's be quite brave and just go, and let's not interview people, and let's see how much we can do. Once we'd made that decision, of course, we were on a course that we couldn't turn back from, because you can't have, 50 minutes, and then it's like, oh, let's just cut to an interview, So we had to find ways of bringing it in, which one of the things we did, talking about oral history, we were tracking down, one of the key scenes in Senna is Senna driving through Monaco. And you've got this brilliant kind of point of view shot, very visceral, very vital footage. And he talks about being in the zone, essentially. Yeah. And it's a famous kind of thing which every sports person now talks about. But we saw that in a publication, I think it was Autosport. And it's like, wouldn't it be great if we could find him, we were thinking, could we get an actor to say those words? And then I said, well, why don't I just contact the journalist? Maybe he's still got the tape. And he's like, no, it's lost. 6 months later, he found it in his attic. No. So it's the classic thing where, one, actually all archives end up in the attic or in the basement. And if you want to work with archive, that's what
trash.
Or as the BBC are now doing with all their VHS tapes, throwing them away. Which is a crazy thing to do in my mind, anyway. But it's there is so much archive out there, and it's not just the film version. It's that it's.
I found it. Sorry. I found it fascinating the feeling of working with other people's work. I felt like a thief.
Right. It's very personal. Sometimes, what I find is that when you talk to someone, it's like, oh yeah, but you won't want to see this, or I don't want to show it to you. And it's very similar to when you're doing an interview. You want to get the good stuff from people. It's exactly the same process. You can't just go, right, give it all to me, and assuming that they're giving you everything. Archive doesn't work that way.
I just want to go back to that point between the wallpaper and the archive that seems to speak to us, because I find that runs through our conversation a little bit. In the first instance, you get the impression that the archive is almost inert and all the agency lies with you. In the second, other extreme, antipodian position, you think the archive instructs you to do things and all the agency lies with the archive. And I think there's a bit of a fallacy in that, which maybe is translated through the trivial remark that history teaches us lessons. In actuality, it's always the present that instructs the past. So you're always driving the process, both for the wallpaper and when you think that you're actually just the agent of the archives. And I think it's important to realize that though you get the impression that there is an intrinsic logic and something is sort of filmic language and things come together and you are just executing orders that come from the past, in actuality you are still instructing the whole thing.
That from my point of view, almost, I'm desperately trying to go off and make other films, but I keep getting said, oh, come and work on it, be this person who spends 2 years finding everything you can about Senna and now Amy Winehouse, and it's like, but it's this sense that I'm there digging things up. I'm not. It's that the past it's always coming from the present. It is, you are instructing it from where you are. You're looking for a purpose for it. But the other side is that you also need places like the British Library, because if they don't exist, then these memories are going to just disappear.
Well, I'm struck by one. There are many threads going here that I think are all extremely interesting and worth exploring. But one is around the idea of the interview in its various forms. You've just described a print journalist little throwaway recording. We've mentioned also rushes in all their forms, and I remember the BBC being concerned about the nature of rushes, because I've done loads of television interviews myself for documentaries, and you're rather ruthless when you're listening and thinking, what do I need for my film now? Whereas in 30, 50 years' time, it'll be the bits I rejected that will turn out to be the ephemera, the thing that was not quite said, the half hint or the other anecdote that actually has grown in value, and we need to get better at understanding that. And then, I mean, most illuminating from Mandy, that sense that you had something that had been set up not for documentary purposes in a traditional sense, but as an oral history project. And it was because those interviews had been done for a quite other reason, which was just memorializing something, that you were able then to find a wholly unexpected documentary within it. And that's been, for me, library the last 6 months, getting to know the oral history side of the British Library, which initially I thought, well, what's that all about? Is this a documentary thing? What is it? And there's, among other huge things at the library, there's a thing called National Life Stories, which in various forms has been going since the late 80s, early 90s. Hundreds now of interviews with people from all walks of life, artists, scientists, business people, lawyers, and so on, constructed in a way utterly different from a television documentary, often conducted with individual over a period of many years. Right, yeah. I saw the artist Richard Wentworth, who began his engagement with the library about 8 years ago. There's hundreds of hours now of conversation, all transcribed, more to come. And within that is building up something of a quite different order. It's beyond rushes, as it were. It's a resource that will still yield for decades or centuries to come, because it's much more like the piles of papers we get when we get someone's personal archives. You've gone into intimate, and sometimes it's not all, by the way, it can't all be put on the web, some of it is behind closed doors only, and they have the right to withhold for some years. Yeah. But nonetheless, for me as a sort of, I was going to say former filmmaker, I still feel it's all a continuum, you begin to get a sense that if we loosen the edges of our categories, there are thousands more stories to be told.
Annabelle.
Just briefly on that, I'm always tempted to use oral history and have tried in various films, but it's always pretty challenging because, essentially, your point, in making a film, you select your story, you've got a kind of driving narrative, and these oral histories are mostly recorded for memorializing, so they're not, the questions aren't angled. And so many times I've found kind of, say with servants, a tiny bit of the right person of the right age in the right place telling us a little bit about her life in servitude, but it doesn't work because the angle isn't right. And so time and again, from a filmmaking point of view, it's been a kind of tempting but frustrating process of working with oral history. That's right. I think we need to think about how to do that. I'm sure we can somehow crack that.
Well, it may be also to do that what it can do is provide an inspiration or a lead, which I think is what happened with Plot for Peace, clearly. Yeah. You kind of, one thing, a primary research resource.
When you're talking about rushes, it just made me think of, and it is, as being a filmmaker at the BBC, you're cutting things and you've got all these rushes sitting around. Made me think of Adam Curtis, which of course you're involved in. One of the best things that happens in Adam Curtis films is that he uses the tail and the end of these interviews, which were never meant to be. He's not interested in the proper. Yeah, exactly, and that's where that is. It's one of those kind of interesting things you do find. And from my side, it's I'm always looking for that as well. It's one of the things that people, and it is rather interesting with Senna, they come back to, it's like, wow, where did you get all those, it's the drivers' briefings, when they're sitting there talking, the drivers are sitting around talking about what they're going to do. It's like, well, I just asked. It wasn't that it was hidden, that it was no, and it's a Formula One archive, so everyone's expecting, oh, we just want the bit where Nigel Mansell's overtaking Senna, and it's like, it is that kind of thing, well, what else is on the shelf? Let me see the beginning and ends of these things. And just using archive in a way that, you know, we all end up using archive in very specific and illustrative ways, but part of I think the key, what we learned in Senna as well, is that, okay, you reach a point where we've unearthed an awful lot of material, but you've got to reuse material in a way, which I guess goes back to your point about, actually, it's not the past, it's how we're using it in the present.
Just to add one sentence to this, having worked as a journalist, it's very much the same. There are many very important events that never get reported. It's not because something happens that even important, it would be reported. Only when it is amenable, and if it is amenable to storytelling, to narrative, which has its own violence to fit in. And so then it becomes a media product, and it becomes reported. While we still think something happens, if it's important, it needs to be reported. It doesn't.
Mm-hmm. I saw this year an exhibition, a photography exhibition. There were photographies by a photographer who died a couple of decades ago, and he was photographing a very little village in Spain, and he was not an artist. He was never considered an artist. But it was, he took pictures for people who paid him at a wedding or at a birthday or whatever to take a picture of portraits. And then it was his daughter nowadays that brought back all these pictures and put them into a museum. And then it became art, and now it's considered art by people. So, you know, the point is regarding how we use the archive now. Who is the artist? The photographer in those days, or the daughter who decided this is art and put it into a museum?
Well, what a brilliantly made film does, when using, for instance, Film Archive, is suddenly add colossal value to a piece of footage that was considered trivial or marginal in its time, and it can acquire poetic meaning or emotional meaning. And that's true, we find, as a research institution. Now, 100, 150 years on for the Victorian era, the researchers who come to the British Library don't want to look for the novels of Thomas Hardy or Dickens. These are easily available. It's the ephemera, it's the marginalia, the bits that were unconsidered at the time, like in Servants, actually. That's the kind of, you know, low-grade literature. That's now what we want to look at, because somehow it's at those edges, the unconsidered edges, as time goes by, you can acquire new meanings and new value. And that's fascinating and very common, a common thread across here. Which is why I think, by the way, with our manuscripts, it's the marginalia, it's the scribbles, it's the personal handwriting or annotation.
The notes that go alongside are always really essential, I think. We've got about 10 minutes left, so if there's any questions, we'd love to take some questions. We're going to need you, it's being recorded, so we need to bring a microphone over, so you could just say your name and then ask your question.
Is this being recorded for the British Library?
Yeah, you are. This is everything is an archive. Yes, yeah. Everything is for posterity.
Yeah. I was just wondering how you go about trying to explore a certain thing in the British Library. Really, I haven't yet developed it actually, but I will be looking for stuff from the early 1700s actually. I don't know exactly what you have or how to even go about it really.
Very brief. Good question. Two things. If you go to the website, it'll all be explained, but I mean, the truth is anyone can get a reader's pass. It takes 10 minutes to, you will need to come to London, you'll need to come to the building itself, particularly for 17th century material, because a little bit of it, I should say, is digitized. The most conspicuous high-value manuscripts may be digitized, but the interesting stuff that we're talking about basically isn't. But all you need to do, you don't need to be an academic, you don't need to be anything, you just need to have identified one piece in our collections you think you want to look at and write a single sentence about, and it can be as general as I think I want to do something on the early 17th century. And two forms of ID, 10 minutes, we'll get you in. You'll probably need to be in the rare books and manuscripts reading rooms. And once you're in, then that's what they do there. The curators and the reader assistants are there to help you on your journey.
One piece of advice is actually I renewed my pass at the British Library just just this week.
Was that in anticipation?
No. Because I'm there looking through magazines at the moment. But you need to bring 2 pieces of ID. My passport, and I brought in a utility bill, but it needs to be within the last 3 months because they wouldn't accept my gas bill from last year. So just as a note for that.
Very good.
Yeah. Any more? Yeah, there's a question behind.
Hello, I'm new to filmmaking, but the thing that I'm really fascinated by the idea of how you could use archives, but the thing that puts me off is the idea of negotiation and cost, and nobody's really touched on actually...
I've talked for, a long time about this.
Could you just touch a little bit on how you go about that and how you overcome those sort of problems?
Don't be scared by it. I mean, if from the other...
It's scary.
Yeah, but think of it, but from the other side is that as a filmmaker, if you're out there, say you're making a film about the Dockfest and someone wants to come and use your rushes that you've shot, you're not just going to give them to someone. And if someone just said, well, I want them, there's a process of negotiation that takes place, and that's the starting point. Everything has got copyright attached to it in some way. Copyright law works in a very interesting way, that it protects the copyright, the person who owns it and created it, but it also protects us as filmmakers and storytellers to go and use it as well. So it's,
Paul, you're completely scaring him.
No, what you need to do, it's like anything else. It's like you're not going to, if you're going to buy a house, you need to go and get it surveyed and you need to do proper things. So it's like, don't just jump into it. But there are processes, but they're not that scary. They're not that scary. It's just that everything has copyright attached to it, and you just need to remember that. You can't just say, right, I'm going to use that clip from the new Superman movie and put it in my film because I want to. That's unfortunately, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Oh, over here.
It's kind of in relation to that question the gentleman's just asked, but regards to how you were doing Senna, and you actually got the archive and started working from the archive, were you having to pay before you could use it, or was it a case of, right, well, because you really built the structure from the archive, which means using a lot of archive from a lot of places. Can you sorry, I'm talking.
You're in a position where, so sometimes, yes, with all archive and institutions of archive and memories, there's the key of access. Access is kind of the key to most things in that, 15 years ago, people started digitizing all their archives, film and video and audio, and put them on the internet, thinking, oh, that's it. No one, it's there, and get access to it. With Formula One, we're in various positions where, say, the footage, the Super 8 footage we showed at the beginning, we were in limbo that we hadn't struck a deal yet with Formula One management through Bernie Ecclestone, so we couldn't get access to their archive. So I went over, but the way it worked was that all of the different Grand Prix, they had people there filming them, and they would then send the tapes to Bernie Ecclestone later on, but they kept their own copies. So even though they didn't own the copyright, they had their own copies. So I went over to Paris, found the people there, found, well, even though that that was shot by an Italian cameraman, that copyright had now passed to someone else. I became friends with this person who owns the archive, and they essentially gave me the masters on the promise that later on we would pay them for what we used in the film. So that's essentially how it works. You end up having a license fee for what you use that goes into the film. So, but some people will try and charge you money just to get to look at the material. It's where they monetize the whole thing. But
put in your budget money for the research tapes even. Because even when we're going to look for archives, be it in the Mozambican or even the South African national archives, which are public, you still got to pay to get the VHS copies or the DVD copies. And that you can use, you're not paying for the rights, and then you go back and negotiate the rights. For example, in a more traditional documentary.
Yeah, we'll think of it as if you're going to do a recce for your traditional documentary, there are costs attached. Think of it in exactly the same way. If I'm going to the British Library to recce, there are going to be costs attached. You don't have to pay to get into the British Library, but other libraries you do have to pay to get into. And so there is no, if you're thinking of archive as a cheap way of making films, forget it. absolutely forget it. It's exactly the same cost. So this gentleman, he's been,
Hello, my name is Karl Dallas, and I've been writing about contemporary music since the early 50s. And I've interviewed everybody from Karl-Heinz Stockhausen to Pink Floyd.
Wow.
And an audio track from one of my interviews was included in a movie about Bob Marley. And currently there's a movie about Tubular Bells just being put together. And they've interviewed me for that, but they've also accessing my archive. Now, there's an issue here. I was persuaded to put my archive of over 50 years of work, audio tapes, transcripts, magazine articles, LPs, test pressings and so on, and a little bit of video, but mostly audio, with the Institute of Popular Music in Liverpool University. The deal was they would get it digitized and put it online. But when they tried to get funding for that, because of course it's quite an expensive business, the potential funders said, who owns the copyright of the interview? See, if I've interviewed Pink Floyd, as I have, there was years when I was the only person in the world they would speak to, because they said, you're not a journalist, Karl, you're a mate. Anyway, I didn't think to get a release from them.
Well,
so I own the recording, that's quite clear. But their voice speaking on my recording, who owns that? And then there's a brief supplementary, and I'm addressing it to you, sir. Since the archive in Liverpool is doing nobody any good at all, can I bring it to the British Museum?
We'll have a chat afterwards.
Well, as with all, we've now reached that point of where archive always goes to, of actually the copyright issue and the murky grey area of copyright in terms of who owns things. Whenever, I remember, working on something for ITV a long time ago, and their head of legal in terms of, well, how do you want to use this? As if I'm actually, because the law, copyright law is there in, it is a grey area in terms of that we don't, it's quite clear if you're a photographer, you take the photograph, you own the copyright, at least in the UK. And then there are other issues that go with it, which are now being, if you take a photograph of someone and they've got a Nike swoosh logo on their T-shirt, then, some broadcasters don't want to show that photograph until they've actually got everyone involved. Archive, as it's like, with Mitchell and Kenyon, there are going to be surviving kind of relatives of people who appeared in that. It's like, how far do you go with this? It's like, you, as the person actually taking, recording the interview, I would argue that, yes, you've got rights in that, but it's...
I think
exactly, that's the point, yeah. The case law has to be created.
Because there's a lack of case law, there are elements of we're all finding this in the digital age, particularly this issue of trying to publish stuff to the open web, where the law wasn't written for the age of the open web, for the publication of long-form research materials and so on. Constantly, institutions like ours are having to make judgment calls about what can and cannot go up there. I mean, only a fragment of our sound archive is online for that reason. But at least it is freely accessible in reading rooms. And so
there's a wonderful term called await claim.
The BBC is predicated on await claims. If all the await claims ever came in, the BBC would be bankrupt.
Exactly.
But I'm in a very similar position at the moment. Working on this film about Amy Winehouse, what we're trying to do is to get her to narrate the film, essentially. But of course, like with Senna, the one person we can't interview is Amy Winehouse. But people like yourself have interviewed her at various points. Some journalists straight away, of course, they never got a release form signed. Some of them, it's like, we want some money to access this, or some of them like, no, we just want to be involved in the film. We think it's a great thing. From our side, as the storytellers, as the filmmakers, we're kind of reliant upon sometimes the good deeds of people bringing this archive to us. But also, we do need a structure. We do need to know that there's laws that protect us, because we have a chain of title at the end of every film that we have to, all of our lawyers going, well, where's the signed document for this? It's like, well, we don't have it. And sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. But there is no easy answer to that question, unfortunately, other than it needs to become, a case law, unfortunately. Any more questions? Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, the gentleman there who's been waiting for...
This is for you.
Good.
How has your approach to archive changed with like the Amy Winehouse film? Because there's so much content on her. Have you found it more difficult than, say, stuff that was further in the past? Because she was on the news for, it'll take you a lifetime to watch.
It's where it's well, to put it into context. Say with Senna, we were very lucky in that he was in a world where it was kind of there was a Spanish Grand Prix, and then a week later there was a Portuguese Grand Prix, and it was all kind of looking inward. Just to give you an idea, whenever you turn up to a Formula One Grand Prix, Bernie Ecclestone, Formula One management, own that track legally for the 3 days that it takes place. So everything that happens is all within one archive, essentially. So we were lucky enough that we could kind of restrict our archive looking and inspiration to them and the host broadcasters. So it would have been TV Globo in Brazil, Fuji TV, whatever. And between all of those and then tracking down the individual kind of freelance camera people they used, we would manage to do it. But you're right, every Amy Winehouse concert, there are potentially 500 camera people filming, and it's all on YouTube. So the approach is similar. With Senna, I personally looked through about 5,000 hours worth of footage. Hopefully, we're not going to have that much, because it's the same team who made Senna and making Amy that we've refined the process. Well, it's one of those things that once you decide, it's actually the archive is the inspiration. So if it's not in the archive, it's not going to be in the movie. We know, sadly, how the story ends. We know that there are certain things which are going to be, it's not a bad thing having 50 cameras, filming one event. And the fact that, every time Amy stepped out of her door, there were paparazzi, just everywhere. What we're discovering is actually that's not the most interesting thing. What we want is the camera from her point of view, looking out. So hopefully we can approach it from that way. But the easy answer is that we don't really know. I mean, it's incredibly bitty. It is maybe one of the things about the way the digital world has changed archive is that it's not one institution. They end up in institutions, but it's, well, I guess with servants, it's like, there would have been hundreds of things which have ended up somewhere. We're in that process. It's not, the digital world's not that different from the world before. What will happen is that most of the digital world will be erased as well. So, it's all of the servers, all of the G-RAIDs and things, that'll disappear in 10 years. It's like we hope that it'll be kept somewhere else.
I was just wondering, because I see from, you're an archive producer, if I've understood. I mean, how does it work, the dialogue between the producers and the directors, and the choice of material, and the sort of driving the narrative story in what you're doing in the use of archive?
I'll very quickly from my side is that one of the important things that happen is that I always try to manage the expectations of the director in terms of, because they will start imagining archive that maybe doesn't exist. And because I deal with it more, I've got a good idea. I'm always surprised by the archive, but I've got more of an idea maybe than of what's there. So, but yeah, from a director's point of view.
I have to see the archives in order. Yeah, so it is a constant, our archive researcher is this, he is the archive man, and he's got this, he literally not only carries it, it's in his back of his boot, in his car, literally. And so it's an engaging process, because for me, what he might find interesting, I might not find interesting, and vice versa. So it's a real collaborative effort and I think Paul's right. He needs to manage my expectations. I'm sure I saw that shot. I didn't see that shot.
Yeah.
So, but because the more you get, the more ideas come to you for different parts of driving the narrative. And sometimes you don't even think you're going to get something and it's there. So it is a process.
I think that sometimes you feel like you want the archivist, the researcher, to prepare everything for you and have it all organized and limit the amount of archive that you watch. But on the other hand, you don't want to trust him. You don't want to miss anything. You want to go through everything.
We're going to have to wrap it up. But it is that kind of being on the same page is actually, because I have to make big editorial decisions in terms of, I'm not going to look in that can of footage. That might, and it is building up that trust, which is, it's not an easy thing sometimes. That's it's in terms of, I guess it's the definition which is becoming more defined perhaps between a film researcher and an archive producer. I think we need to end it there, but thank you very much. Hopefully you've been inspired in some way. Thanks.
Wow, great.
And go to your libraries, go to your local libraries. They are sources of great inspiration.